Welcome to this deep dive into the source material. We know exactly who you are.
We do.
You're a learner. Maybe you're a medical student staring down just a massive pile of epidemiology notes, trying to prep for board exams. Or, maybe you're a junior doctor navigating the wards, completely exhausted by the daily grind, just trying to figure out why hospital policies are actually structured the way they are.
Or perhaps a public health trainee trying to make sense of massive population-level data sets.
Exactly. You're here because you need clear, high-yield conceptual frameworks. You want the deep understanding, the actual mechanics of how this stuff works, but without drowning in all that academic jargon.
Right, no jargon.
Yeah.
And today we have a truly fundamental set of sources to guide us through what is honestly one of the most complex areas of medical science.
It really is. So to kick us off, how should we be thinking about this?
Well, to frame today's discussion, I want to offer an overarching metaphor that I think really captures the essence of what we're going to explore.
Okay, I love a good metaphor. Lay it on me.
Imagine traditional clinical medicine. In standard clinical practice, the kind of medicine most people are familiar with, you are essentially a gardener tending to a single tree in a pot.
A single tree. Okay.
You have an incredible amount of control. You can analyze the soil, you can measure the exact amount of water you pour in, you can prune specific branches, and crucially, you can closely monitor that one specific tree's physiological response to your interventions.
So if the leaves turn yellow, you just adjust the fertilizer.
Exactly. The feedback loop is tight, it's individual, and it's relatively contained. But community public health operates on a completely different paradigm. In public health, you're stepping out of the greenhouse entirely. You're attempting to engineer the entire forest ecosystem.
Wow. That paints a really vivid picture, because when you're dealing with a forest, you can't just treat one tree in isolation and expect to understand the whole environment.
You really can't. Those trees are inextricably linked.
Yeah, they share the same water table, the same nutrient profile in the soil. Their root networks physically intertwine beneath the surface. When a storm rolls in or some pathogen sweeps across the canopy, it affects the whole system.
Right. If you want to understand whether a new agricultural treatment works in that wild environment, you have to look at the ecosystem as a whole.
And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are making that monumental leap from the controlled laboratory to the messy, interconnected reality of human society.
We are going to unpack the methodological architecture of community intervention trials, which you might also see referred to as cluster randomized trials.
Cluster randomized trials.
And we're going to examine the evaluation of population-level screening programs. Our overarching goal is to equip you with the mental models necessary to critically evaluate these massive ecosystem-level interventions.
And we should acknowledge our sources here. We are drawing our frameworks directly from two highly authoritative chapters in the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health.
Specifically, we'll be dissecting Chapter 5.8 by Alan Donner, which meticulously covers the methodological issues in the design and analysis of community intervention trials.
And alongside that, we'll integrate Chapter 11.4 by Alison Streetley and Lars Elhers, which tackles the complexities of population screening.
We're going to weave together epidemiology, public policy, governance, and advanced statistics into one cohesive, practical picture.
So let's start with the fundamental paradigm shift. I think a lot of junior doctors or medical students might ask, well, why do we even need community-level interventions in the first place?
That's a fair question.
Right. Why can't we just focus on treating everyone as an individual patient one by one?
The answer is that some interventions, just by their very nature, inherently cannot be delivered to individuals in isolation.
Like water fluoridation.
Exactly. Water fluoridation to prevent dental caries, or a mass media health promotion campaign about wearing seatbelts. You can't put up a billboard about road safety on a busy highway and somehow magically restrict it so that only half the town is allowed to look at it, while the other half acts as a control group.
Right. You can't unsee the billboard. But the rationale goes much deeper than just the physical mechanism of delivery, doesn't it?
It does. It's fundamentally about how human beings actually behave, interact, and influence one another. The concept of herd immunity is the classic biological illustration of this principle.
So when you run a vaccination campaign and immunize a certain percentage of the population, you aren't just protecting those specific individuals who got the shot.
No, you're effectively protecting the unvaccinated individuals as well, because you have fundamentally altered the ecosystem. You've broken the chain of transmission. The intervention's true efficacy only reveals itself at the population level.
But what is truly fascinating is that this exact same principle applies to complex social behaviors, too. The textbook highlights a landmark historical example to illustrate this, the COMMIT trial,
Ah, yes, commit.
which stands for Community Intervention Trial for Smoking Cessation. And it was this massive undertaking that chose to randomize entire cities rather than individual people.
I want to spend some time on the commit trial because it perfectly illustrates the why behind community trials. Picture the landscape of the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Right, smoking was everywhere, heavily ingrained in daily life.
Exactly. If researchers had decided to test a new smoking cessation program by just randomizing individual people within a single city, they would have run into a brick wall. Imagine you're a heavy smoker assigned to the intervention group,
Okay, so I'm getting counseling. I'm trying my best to quit.
but then you go to work and your colleagues in the control group are lighting up in the break room. You go to a restaurant and the air is just thick with smoke.
So the social norms of that city act as this profoundly powerful, invisible, confounding variable, pulling me back into the habit. I can't just fix the tree if the soil is still toxic.
That is the exact realization the community researchers had. Smoking is a deeply social behavior, reinforced by environmental cues and cultural acceptability.
It is exponentially easier for a heavy smoker to successfully quit if they live in an environment where smoking has been systematically made socially unacceptable.
The researchers realized they needed to change the entire ecosystem. So they implemented citywide interventions, advocating for workplace smoking bans, mobilizing community organizations, training local healthcare providers, and launching coordinated local media campaigns.
And by randomizing at the city level, they ensured that the intervention group was immersed in a new set of social norms, while the control group cities maintained the status quo. You have to alter the environment to facilitate the change in the individual.
And if community interventions like the Commuter trial are how we actively engineer the forest, we need a way to monitor the health of that forest on a massive scale.
Which naturally brings us to the concept of population screening. Screening programs are essentially our early warning radar systems for the entire ecosystem.
But before we get into the mechanics of how we evaluate them, we need to clarify our terminology. Because out on the wards, the word screening gets thrown around very casually.
Constantly.
And the textbook is extremely strict about differentiating it from standard clinical practice.
It's a critical distinction, especially for anyone listening who's preparing for board exams. Clinicians operate in a world of symptomatic illness.
Let's look at a common scenario. A patient with a 10-year history of poorly controlled diabetes comes into your clinic for a routine checkup. As part of your standard protocol, you systematically examine their retinas for signs of diabetic retinopathy, and you check their feet for peripheral neuropathy.
And in the break room, a doctor might refer to that as screening for complications.
But from a rigorous public health and epidemiological perspective, that is absolutely not screening. That is termed opportunistic testing or case finding.
Because you are applying a diagnostic test to an existing patient who is already integrated into the healthcare system, seeking care for a known underlying condition.
Right. So how did the foundational texts, specifically McCune and the framework established by the UK National Screening Committee, actually define true screening?
They define it as a systematic public health service that is proactively offered to a defined population of people who consider themselves to be completely healthy.
You aren't waiting for someone to walk into your clinic complaining of a lump or a cough.
No, you're actively reaching out into the community to people who feel perfectly fine, who haven't asked for any medical advice, and you are offering them a test. You're implicitly telling them, take this test, it might save your life.
And that implicit promise is where the immense ethical and methodological burden originates. When a sick patient comes to you pleading for help, the risk-benefit calculus is straightforward. They are already suffering, and your intervention aims to alleviate that suffering.
But intervening on a massive population of healthy people is fraught with peril. The textbook emphasizes that screening programs can, and regularly do, cause profound harm.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this brings us to a concept that feels deeply counterintuitive: the paradox and the peril of screening.
We've been culturally conditioned to believe that early detection is always better. It's a fantastic marketing slogan.
It is, but the biological and statistical reality is significantly darker. When you roll out a screening test to tens of thousands or millions of healthy individuals, you are mathematically guaranteed to generate false positives.
And we really have to remember what a false positive actually means in the real world. It isn't just a minor data anomaly in a spreadsheet.
A false positive is a deeply traumatic human experience. It's a phone call that shatters someone's sense of security. It initiates weeks or months of profound psychological anxiety.
Not to mention, it triggers a cascade of invasive follow-up procedures, biopsies, endoscopies, exploratory surgeries.
All of which carry their own inherent, non-trivial risks of infection, hemorrhage, or other iatrogenic complications.
And beyond the false positives, we must confront the physical hazards of the screening tests themselves, like the cumulative, long-term ionizing radiation exposure from decades of routine mammography or CT scans.
But perhaps the most insidious harm detailed in the sources is the phenomenon of overdiagnosis.
Overdiagnosis is a concept that is incredibly difficult to explain to patients and, honestly, sometimes difficult for clinicians to fully internalize. It's not a false positive.
Right, a false positive is when the test says there is cancer, but there isn't. Overdiagnosis is when the test detects a true biological abnormality, say a microscopic slow-growing prostate cancer or a low-grade breast lesion.
But it's an abnormality that is so indolent, it would never have caused the patient any symptoms, and it would never have shortened their natural lifespan.
They would have eventually died of old age or a heart attack, completely unaware that this tiny cluster of cells even existed.
But the tragedy of overdiagnosis is that once you ring the bell, you cannot unring it. Once that indolent lesion is detected, the standard of care almost universally dictates intervention.
You can't easily tell a patient you have cancer, but let's just ignore it. So the patient undergoes radical prostatectomies, debilitating chemotherapy, or targeted radiation.
They suffer the life-altering side effects, incontinence, impotence, chronic pain, cardiac toxicity, for a disease that was never actually a threat to them.
They were subjected to the harms of treatment without any possibility of benefiting from it because they were never in danger. This is deeply tied to a statistical concept called length-time bias.
Let's unpack length-time bias, too. If I'm casting a net, which is what a screening program essentially is, I'm much more likely to catch the slow, lazy fish.
The aggressive, fast-growing, highly lethal tumors tend to spring up rapidly and become symptomatic in the intervals between scheduled screening rounds.
Right, a patient feels a rapidly growing lump 6 months after a clear scan. The screening program naturally disproportionately detects the slow-growing, less aggressive tumors.
Simply because those tumors reside in the body in an asymptomatic state for a much longer window of time, giving the screening test ample opportunity to find them.
And this convergence of overdiagnosis and public perception culminates in a sociological phenomenon that Raffel and Gray described in their 2007 text, which they call the popularity paradox.
It is a brilliant, if somewhat cynical, observation about public health policy. The popularity paradox posits that the greater the harm a screening program inflicts upon a population through overdiagnosis and subsequent overtreatment, the more wildly popular and politically unassailable that program becomes.
Wait, I really want to ground this for the listener because that sounds completely backwards. How can harming more people make a program more popular? Let's walk through a hypothetical patient journey.
Okay, imagine a large-scale screening program detects a tiny, non-lethal, slow-growing cancer in a healthy 60-year-old man. Following protocol, he undergoes a radical surgery.
And as a direct result of that surgery, he suffers from permanent complications that severely impact his quality of life.
But here is the psychological catch. He believes, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that the screening program saved his life. He thinks he conquered a deadly disease.
So he becomes a passionate, vocal advocate. He starts charities. He testifies in front of parliamentary committees or Congress, weeping as he thanks the screening program for allowing him to see his grandchildren grow up.
The objective epidemiological reality is that the program harmed him unnecessarily. But the subjective emotional perception is that he was rescued from the brink of death.
This dynamic makes it politically terrifying to shut down harmful screening programs once they have gained momentum. Politicians want to be seen as champions of health, not bureaucrats taking away life-saving tests.
Private clinics and pharmaceutical companies who profit from the testing and subsequent treatments amplify these survivor stories. The program becomes a runaway train, fueled by the very overdiagnosis that makes it harmful.
So, we find ourselves in an incredibly precarious position. If intervening on healthy populations is this fraught with risk, and if public perception and political pressure can be this fundamentally misleading, how do we establish the objective truth?
How do we definitively mathematically prove that a massive community intervention, whether that's a new national screening rollout, a citywide smoking ban, or a school-based nutritional overhaul, actually achieves its goals and does more good than harm?
We cannot rely on passionate anecdotes. We need unimpeachable, robust data. We need to conduct a community intervention trial. And the moment we decide to do that, we have to confront the statistical elephant in the room.
The elephant in the room is a fundamental statistical concept known as intracluster correlation. To truly grasp the gravity of this, we should begin with a stark historical warning issued by the prominent statistician Jerome Cornfield in 1978.
What did he say?
Reviewing the state of public health research, he stated randomization by cluster, accompanied by an analysis by individual, is an exercise in self-deception.
An exercise in self-deception. That is incredibly strong language for a statistician writing in an academic journal. What exactly was he calling out there?
Let's picture a scenario to make this concrete. Suppose I am a researcher and I want to test a novel intensive health education curriculum. I randomly assign 10 entire villages to receive this new curriculum and 10 villages to act as my control group, receiving standard health advice.
Okay, let's keep the math simple and say there are exactly 100 people in each village. That gives me a total study population of 2,000 people.
When it comes time to analyze my results, my natural instinct, especially if I've only ever run clinical trials on individual patients, would be to dump all 2,000 of those data points into my statistical software and hit Analyze.
Treating them as if I had just flipped a coin 2,000 separate times for 2,000 independent strangers.
And if you proceed with that analysis, you are committing a cardinal sin of epidemiological methodology. You are, as Cornfield warned, deceiving yourself.
Because of the assumption of independence, most standard statistical tests, t-tests, chi-squares, standard regressions, they are built on the foundational assumption that every single data point is completely independent of every other data point.
But in your scenario, those 1,000 individuals in the intervention group are not independent pieces of information. People who reside in the same village tend to be similar in ways that impact health outcomes.
They might share a similar socioeconomic background, they're exposed to the same environmental pollutants, they access the same local healthcare clinic, they likely have similar diets based on local agriculture.
And crucially, they interact socially. Because of these shared factors, their responses to your health curriculum will cluster together. If the curriculum resonates with the local culture, a large portion of the village might adopt it simultaneously. The data points echo one another.
The sources outline 3 specific mechanisms for why this clustering, this echo chamber effect occurs. First, it can be externally induced.
For example, if one village happens to have a very aggressive local mayor who implemented strict local bylaws about smoking in public parks long before your trial started, that external factor will correlate the outcomes of everyone in that village.
Second, it can be internally induced through demographics. Perhaps one village experienced an economic downturn, and all the young, mobile adults migrated to the city for work, leaving behind an older, more vulnerable demographic.
And third, there is simply the power of social interaction. If my neighbor starts jogging every morning because of the community health program, I might start jogging just because I see them doing it and we chat over the fence. My health outcome and my neighbor's health outcome are inextricably linked.
To quantify this linkage, statisticians rely on a vital metric, the intracluster correlation coefficient, commonly abbreviated as ICC.
And represented by the Greek letter rho. Rho is the mathematical measurement of the intensity of that echo chamber. Formally, the textbook defines rho as the proportion of the overall variance in a trial outcome that can be specifically attributed to the variation between the different clusters, as opposed to the variation among individuals within the same cluster.
So if rho is precisely 0, it indicates that every individual within a village is completely independent. Knowing one person's health outcome provides you with absolutely 0 predictive information about their next-door neighbor's outcome.
Conversely, if rho is exactly 1, it means everyone in the village acts as a monolith. They all respond identically to the intervention.
Now, in the real world of community trials, rho is almost always a positive number, but it's typically a very small fraction. It's exceedingly rare to encounter a negative rho.
Right, which would imply a bizarre scenario where people living in the same village are somehow more different from each other than they are from people living in entirely different regions.
Usually, when researchers calculate rho for health behaviors or chronic disease outcomes, they find it hovering somewhere between 0.01 and 0.05.
What's fascinating here is that, historically, this is where the self-deception crept in. An investigator would look at a rho of 0.01, think to themselves, well, 1% is practically nothing, and they would consciously choose to ignore it.
Proceeding to analyze their data as if it were a standard individual trial.
Dismissing a tiny rho is a fatal architectural flaw in trial design. Ignoring it inevitably leads to a massive inflation of your type I error rate.
To review, a type I error is a false positive. It occurs when your statistical analysis confidently tells you that your intervention was a resounding success, but in reality, it had absolutely no effect whatsoever. You're detecting a signal that is entirely composed of statistical noise amplified by the echo chamber.
The mechanism by which a tiny rho destroys your trial is governed by a crucial underlying formula, the variance inflation factor, or VIF.
I want to make sure we cement this formula because it is the linchpin of everything we're discussing. The formula is VIF equals 1 plus, in parentheses, m minus 1 multiplied by rho.
Let me state that clearly again. VIF equals 1 plus m minus 1 times rho. The m in this equation represents your cluster size, the number of individuals you have sampled within each village or community.
This formula provides the ultimate aha moment for understanding why community trials are so difficult. Let's run a practical example. Let's assume you have that seemingly negligible rho of just 0.01.
But because you are running a community trial, you sampled a robust 100 people per village. Your cluster size m is 100. Let's walk through the math.
Okay, we start inside the parentheses. Our cluster size m is 100. We subtract 1, giving us 99.
We then multiply that 99 by our tiny intercluster correlation coefficient, rho, which is 1.99. That gives us 0.99.
Finally, we add the 1 at the beginning of the formula. Our resulting variance inflation factor is 1.99. For simplicity's sake, let's round that up to 2.0.
A variance inflation factor of 2.0.
I want to translate what that number actually means for a researcher out in the field. It means your effective sample size has just been slashed in half.
You expended the budget, the time, and the manpower to recruit 100 individual people in that village. You gathered all their survey data, you paid for all their blood tests.
But because of the correlated nature of their environment, because of that 1% echo chamber effect, those 100 people only yield the statistical information equivalent to 50 truly independent, unassociated individuals.
If you ignore the VIF, you are lying to your statistical software. The software assumes you have twice as much independent data as you actually possess.
It becomes artificially overconfident. It calculates a beautifully narrow confidence interval and hands you a highly significant p-value.
You publish a landmark paper claiming your intervention revolutionized the community's health, when in fact, you just fell victim to a colossal type I error.
This mathematical reality reinforces Cornfield's warning. If you embark on designing a community trial, accounting for the intracluster correlation coefficient is non-negotiable.
It must be factored into your sample size calculations during the initial blueprinting phase, and it must dictate your statistical modeling during the final analysis.
And building that mathematical architecture correctly requires you to first define exactly what it is you are trying to measure, which introduces the concept of the unit of inference.
This is where trial architecture gets fascinating. When designing the blueprint, you have to separate two concepts in your mind: the unit of allocation, which is what you are randomizing, and the unit of inference, which is what you are actually trying to draw conclusions about.
They are not always the same thing. To illustrate this, the textbook points to a monumental piece of historical epidemiology, the vitamin A supplementation trials conducted in Nepal and Indonesia by Alfred Sommer and his colleagues in the late 1980s and early 90s.
Those trials represent a watershed moment in global public health. Sommer was investigating whether mild vitamin A deficiency was contributing to massive rates of childhood mortality from infectious diseases.
The intervention was straightforward, providing high-dose vitamin A capsules. In a perfect theoretical world, you would just walk into a village and randomize individual children. Child A gets the vitamin, child B gets a placebo.
But on the ground in rural Nepal or Indonesia, that individual randomization was a logistical impossibility.
Right, because if you give a mother a vitamin capsule for one of her children and a placebo for the other, or if neighbors talk and realize some kids are getting the real medicine and others aren't, the pills are going to get shared.
Exactly. The intervention will instantly bleed into the control group. Furthermore, just the logistics of tracking individual placebos across rugged remote terrain was unfeasible.
So out of necessity, they shifted their unit of allocation. They randomized entire villages. Village A received the vitamin A program, Village B received standard care.
However, despite randomizing at the village level, the fundamental biological question they were asking had not changed. They weren't trying to prove that vitamin A makes a village healthier in some abstract collective sense.
They were trying to prove that vitamin A prevents an individual child from dying of measles or severe diarrhea. Therefore, the unit of inference remains strictly at the individual level.
They allocated by village, but they drew statistical inferences about individual children. In a design like that, where the allocation is clustered but the inference is individual, navigating the variance inflation factor and adjusting for cluster-level confounding is absolutely critical to the validity of the results.
We can contrast that with another fascinating trial detailed in the text, the Latin American mandatory second opinion trial. This was a health systems intervention.
The researchers were tackling a major systemic issue: the dangerously high rates of unnecessary cesarean sections in Latin American hospitals. The intervention wasn't a pill, it was a bureaucratic policy change.
The new rules stipulated that before an obstetrician could proceed with a non-emergency C-section, they were required to obtain a formal, mandatory second opinion from another physician.
In that study, the researchers randomized entire hospitals. Half the hospitals implemented the new mandatory second opinion policy, and the other half continued with their standard operational protocols.
But pay close attention to the primary endpoint here. The researchers were not attempting to make statistical inferences about the clinical outcome of an individual pregnant woman. The primary endpoint was the hospital's overall rate of cesarean sections over a defined period.
So the unit of allocation was the hospital, and the unit of inference was also the hospital.
When the unit of allocation and the unit of inference are perfectly aligned like that, the statistical burden shifts. You are essentially rolling the data up.
You don't have to agonize over the within-cluster correlation of the individual patients in the same way, because you are analyzing the data at the macro level. You treat the entire hospital's C-section rate as a single, discrete data point in your analysis. It simplifies the math, provided you have enough hospitals to randomize.
Defining these parameters is the first step. But even if your theoretical blueprint is flawless, the reality of executing a community trial introduces severe operational vulnerabilities.
One of the most dangerous traps awaiting researchers in the field is a form of selection bias, known specifically as detect and treat bias.
This bias rears its head when the timeline of your trial is out of order. Specifically, when you randomize communities before you have locked in the specific individuals who will participate.
Let's visualize how this happens in practice. Imagine you are leading a large public health initiative. You have secured funding for an innovative, highly anticipated new preventative therapy. You randomize 10 community health clinics to offer this exciting new therapy and 10 clinics to continue providing the standard, frankly boring, usual care.
Now that the clinics know their assignments, your field staff has to go out into the community and recruit patients to enroll in the study.
This is where human psychology corrupts the data. If the field staff members know which clinic has been assigned the exciting intervention, their behavior will subtly, perhaps unconsciously, shift.
The recruiters assigned to the intervention clinics might hunt harder for participants. Believing in the therapy, they might be more enthusiastic, more persuasive, and willing to spend an extra hour convincing a hesitant patient.
As a result, they might end up recruiting a fundamentally different demographic. Perhaps patients who are more health conscious, more compliant, or have a different baseline risk profile.
Compared to the recruiters toiling away at the control clinics who might just passively enroll whoever walks through the door.
And just like that, the core integrity of your trial is compromised. The entire point of randomizing the clinics was to ensure that the patient populations in both groups were perfectly balanced at baseline.
But because of the detect and treat bias, the enthusiasm of your recruiters has artificially curated two vastly different patient cohorts. You've injected a massive selection bias into the study before the first dose of therapy is even administered.
To prevent this, the textbook insists on strict operational blinding. The recruiters on the ground must be completely blind to the intervention assignment of the clinic while they are identifying, screening, and enrolling subjects.
Only after a patient is formally locked into the trial database should the clinic's assignment be revealed.
An even more robust solution is to identify and legally consent the entire cohort of eligible subjects prior to performing the randomization step. However, in the messy reality of large-scale community trials, identifying every participant up front is often logistically and financially impossible.
Therefore, utilizing independent, blinded recruitment teams is paramount. This constant struggle to defend the integrity of the trial design against the chaotic realities of the real world is also perfectly exemplified by the ongoing war between experimental contamination and statistical precision.
Experimental contamination is the bane of public health research. It occurs when your carefully deployed intervention leaks over the boundary lines and accidentally infects your control group.
Imagine running an intensive dietary education program in a mid-sized town. If you randomize neighborhoods and the intervention neighborhood is literally right across the street from the control neighborhood, those people are going to interact.
They share the same grocery stores, their kids go to the same schools. The intervention group will inevitably share the new dietary advice with their friends in the control group.
Suddenly, your control group is altering their diet based on the intervention. When you go to measure the final results, the difference between the two groups will look artificially small, masking the true efficacy of the program.
To combat contamination, researchers instinctively try to widen the perimeter. They increase the physical size of the cluster. Instead of randomizing neighborhoods, they randomize entire geopolitical units, counties, or massive administrative districts.
The textbook cites the American Indian Streptococcus pneumonia vaccine trial conducted by Moulton and colleagues as a prime example of this strategy. They were deeply concerned that the herd immunity generated by the vaccine would spread across community lines, contaminating the control groups.
To prevent this, they engineered physical barriers. They actively buffered the geopolitical units, combining several smaller units into massive, sprawling clusters to ensure a vast geographical distance between the vaccinated populations and the control populations.
It's a brilliant epidemiological defense mechanism, but we have to remember the variance inflation factor. Every time you combine units to create a larger cluster to prevent contamination, your cluster size, M, grows significantly larger.
And as M gets larger, your VIF skyrockets. And as your VIF skyrockets, your statistical power evaporates.
It is a brutal zero-sum trade-off. Do you want small, tight clusters that give you excellent statistical precision but leave you highly vulnerable to contamination? Or do you opt for massive buffered clusters that guarantee zero contamination but leave your trial statistically underpowered, incapable of proving the intervention actually worked?
There is no magic solution, only calculated, agonizing compromises, which naturally leads us to the architectural blueprints of the trials themselves. How do lead investigators and statisticians manipulate the allocation of their clusters to wring out every last drop of statistical power when faced with these impossible trade-offs?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's dive into advanced design strategies. When you sit down to draft the protocol for a community trial, you generally have three primary methodologies for how to allocate your clusters into the intervention or control arms.
The completely randomized design, the matched pair design, and the stratified design. Let's break down the mechanics of each.
The completely randomized design is exactly what it sounds like. It is the purest form of the experiment. You take your master list of all participating communities, you essentially flip a coin for each one, and chance alone dictates whether they become an intervention site or a control site.
From a purely theoretical standpoint, the completely randomized design is the gold standard. It is elegant and unbiased. However, it requires a specific condition to be viable. You must have a very large number of clusters available to randomize.
The Indonesian vitamin A trial we discussed earlier is a perfect example. They had over 200 distinct villages.
When you are randomizing 200 units, you invoke the law of large numbers. The sheer volume of coin flips acts as a protective shield. You can be statistically confident that any baseline confounding variables, the average socioeconomic status of the villages, their proximity to a paved road, the baseline prevalence of malnutrition, will naturally balance out evenly between the intervention and control groups, purely by chance.
But what happens when the reality of funding hits? What if you don't have the tens of millions of dollars required to enroll 200 villages? What if your grant only allows you to recruit 20 communities?
If you attempt a completely randomized design with only 20 clusters, you're playing a very dangerous game of statistical roulette.
If you just flip a coin 20 times, there's an uncomfortably high probability that, just by sheer bad luck, all the wealthy, highly educated urban communities end up in the intervention arm, and all the impoverished rural communities end up in the control arm.
If that happens, your trial is dead on arrival. It is fundamentally confounded from day one. To build a safeguard against this disaster scenario, researchers often employ the matched pair design.
The matched pair design holds a very strong intuitive appeal. It feels safe. The process works like this. You survey your 20 available communities extensively before any randomization occurs. You look at all their baseline characteristics and you explicitly pair them up.
You locate two communities that are both large, highly industrialized, and have a historically high baseline rate of smoking. You declare them pair A. Then you find two other communities that are small, agricultural, and have a low baseline smoking rate. That becomes pair B.
You meticulously continue this process until you've constructed 10 perfectly matched pairs. Only then do you introduce the randomization. Within each specific pair, you flip a coin. One community receives the intervention, its identical twin serves as the control.
This was the exact architecture utilized in the massive committed smoking trial we discussed earlier. The investigators constructed 11 meticulously matched pairs of cities, 10 pairs located in the United States and 1 pair in Canada. They matched these cities based on population size, demographic makeup, and geographical proximity.
On paper, it seems like an impenetrable design. It absolutely guarantees that your two trial arms are perfectly balanced regarding those critical baseline factors. It seems so logical that you might ask, why wouldn't every single community trial use this method?
The answer is that matching comes with a severe hidden cost. The cost is exacted in the currency of statistical power, specifically a concept known as degrees of freedom.
To understand degrees of freedom without getting lost in abstract math, think of it as a budget of independent information that your statistical software uses to estimate the natural underlying variability or noise in your data.
In a completely randomized trial of 20 communities, you have a relatively healthy budget of degrees of freedom. You're comparing two large groups against each other.
But the moment you lock those communities into 10 isolated pairs, the mathematics of how you must analyze the data fundamentally changes. You are no longer permitted to pool all the communities together.
Your analysis is strictly confined to evaluating the specific differences within each individual pair. You are evaluating 10 distinct, isolated, pairwise differences.
And here is where the trap snaps shut. As the textbook explicitly warns, if you are conducting a trial with fewer than 10 pairs, say, your k-value is less than 10 pairs, the act of matching can actually result in a net loss of statistical power compared to if you had just completely randomized them and taken your chances.
You have restricted your degrees of freedom, your information budget, so severely that your statistical tests lose their sensitivity. They become blunt instruments, unable to detect a true intervention effect through the noise.
The only scenario where the matched pair design justifies this massive penalty to your degrees of freedom is if the matching is incredibly tight. The textbook introduces the metric rho sub E, which is the matching correlation.
This correlation must be very high, generally at least 0.20 or greater. The two communities in a pair must genuinely behave almost identically regarding the specific health outcome you are measuring.
If you spend all that effort matching communities on factors that turn out to be irrelevant to the disease, you have effectively crippled your trial's statistical power for absolutely no tangible benefit.
Furthermore, the matched pair design harbors another significant methodological limitation. It prevents you from directly estimating the intracluster correlation coefficient, rho, from your trial data.
Let's recall how rho is calculated. It requires measuring the natural variation between different clusters that are being treated exactly the same way. But in a matched pair architecture, you never have two clusters in a pair receiving the same treatment. One always gets the intervention, the other always gets the control.
Therefore, the true effect of your intervention is permanently mathematically entangled with the natural variation between the two communities. You cannot untangle them to extract a clean estimate of rho.
Consequently, when you publish your findings, you cannot provide future researchers with a baseline rho for that specific outcome in that specific population, making it much harder for them to design accurate sample sizes for their own future trials. You are essentially pulling up the ladder behind you.
Because of the severe drawbacks of the matched pair design, the loss of degrees of freedom and the inability to estimate rho, modern trial architects often seek a middle ground. That highly effective compromise is the stratified design.
If matched pair is a rigid one-to-one straitjacket, stratified design is a more flexible, forgiving approach. Instead of forcing communities into identical pairs, you group them into broader buckets, or strata.
The Pathways Obesity Prevention Trial, which focused on American Indian school children, provides a stellar illustration of stratification in action. The researchers had access to 41 distinct schools.
Attempting to force 41 unique schools into 20 perfectly matched pairs would have been an administrative nightmare and would almost certainly have resulted in overmatching on irrelevant variables. Instead, they utilized strata.
They stratified the schools based on their geographic field center location and, critically, on the baseline average percentage of body fat among the student population. They created buckets of schools that shared broad similarities.
Then, within each individual bucket, they randomized roughly half the schools to receive the obesity prevention intervention and the other half to serve as controls.
This architecture is incredibly elegant. It retains the primary benefit of matching. It guarantees a solid baseline balance across the treatment arms for the variables that actually matter, like baseline body fat. but it preserves significantly more degrees of freedom than strict pair matching.
Because you have multiple schools residing in each bucket, the statisticians have much more independent information available to estimate the variance cleanly.
Furthermore, it provides immense flexibility during the final analysis phase. When running the complex regression models at the end of the study, the statisticians can seamlessly incorporate the strata as indicator variables, adjusting for the baseline differences without breaking the mathematical models.
The stratified design truly represents the architectural sweet spot for trials with a moderate number of clusters. However, the textbook also highlights two modern, highly sophisticated innovations in trial design that are worth understanding.
The cluster crossover design and the stepped wedge design. Let's look at the cluster crossover first. In this model, every single participating community eventually experiences both the intervention condition and the control condition, but the sequence in which they experience them is randomized.
For example, Community A implements the intervention for year 1 and then crosses over to act as a control site for year 2. Community B follows the exact reverse sequence.
The overwhelming advantage of a crossover design is that each community acts as its own perfect control. You instantly, mathematically obliterate all the confounding noise caused by the natural variation between different communities.
However, this design rests on a massive, often fragile assumption that there is no carryover effect. This means that once the intervention is turned off, the community must immediately revert to its baseline state.
This works well for something like a temporary change in hospital administrative protocol. But if your intervention permanently alters human behavior, for instance, if you teach a community how to properly read and understand nutritional labels on food packaging, they are not going to suddenly unlearn that skill the moment they cross over into the control period.
The behavioral change carries over, permanently contaminating the subsequent control phase. Therefore, crossover designs are strictly limited to interventions whose effects dissipate rapidly.
When a crossover design is impossible, particularly in the realm of rolling out new public health policies or national screening programs, researchers frequently turn to the stepped wedge design.
This stepped wedge is often deployed when it is deemed politically or ethically unacceptable to permanently withhold a potentially beneficial intervention from a control group.
In a stepped wedge architecture, every single participating community is guaranteed to receive the intervention by the end of the study. What is being randomized is not whether they get it, but when they get it.
The intervention is rolled out in sequential stages. Every few months, a new randomly selected cluster steps over the threshold, transitioning from the control state to the active intervention state.
The statisticians then utilize this staggered longitudinal timeline to isolate and analyze the effect of the intervention as it cascades across the population.
Beyond its statistical utility, the stepped wedge is an operational lifesaver. Implementing a massive new program across 50 communities simultaneously is an administrative nightmare. Training staff, distributing materials, managing supply chains all at once is incredibly prone to failure.
The stepped wedge allows a public health department to roll out the intervention gradually, learning from logistical mistakes in the early clusters and refining their approach as they scale up.
But regardless of whether an investigator chooses a stepped wedge, a stratified design, or a completely randomized approach, they must eventually confront the unyielding mathematics of statistical power. And in the context of community trials, there is a pervasive, highly destructive misconception that we need to thoroughly dismantle.
The misconception is rooted in the intuition cultivated by standard clinical trials, which is that bigger is always better. If you are running an individual-level drug trial and you realize your statistical power is too low to detect a difference, the solution is simple. You just keep recruiting more patients.
The larger your patient pool, the tighter your confidence intervals become, and the more statistical power you generate. It is a linear relationship.
However, in the realm of community intervention trials, that linear logic shatters completely due to the clustering effect.
The textbook codifies this reality in what it calls the 1/row rule. I want to walk through how this trap catches researchers.
Imagine you are halfway through a trial randomizing villages to evaluate a new sanitation program. Your statisticians inform you that the trial is severely underpowered. You are not going to be able to achieve a statistically significant result.
Your instinct as a project manager might be to tell your field recruiters, stay in your assigned villages for an extra month. Double the number of households you survey. If we went from 100 people per village to 500 people per village, we will quintuple our sample size and save the trial.
But if you execute that plan, you will be horrified to discover that your statistical power barely increases at all. You spent a fortune collecting 400 extra data points per village, and it yielded almost zero benefit.
Why? Because in community trials, the variance of an estimated event rate hits a hard, mathematically impermeable floor.
The textbook provides the exact formulation for this mathematical ceiling. The variance of your outcome measure can only ever be reduced down to a theoretical limit of p multiplied by 1 minus p, all divided by k, where k represents the total number of clusters in your trial.
I want you to notice what variable is conspicuously absent from that limit equation m, the cluster size. What this stark mathematical reality dictates is that once your cluster size m reaches a certain threshold specifically, once m exceeds the value of 1 divided by your intra-cluster correlation coefficient, rho adding more individual participants to that existing cluster provides virtually zero additional statistical information.
Let's run the numbers to make this concrete. Let's return to our typical community trial, where the intercluster correlation coefficient, rho, is 0.01. What is the value of 1 divided by 0.01? It is exactly 100.
This means that once your field team has surveyed 100 people within a specific village, you have effectively mined that village for all the useful independent statistical information it can possibly provide regarding the intervention.
If you authorize the budget to recruit 400 more people from that exact same village, you are simply paying to record highly correlated redundant data.
Returning to our earlier metaphor, if the village is an echo chamber, the first 100 people tell you what the original sound was. The next 400 people are just recordings of the echo. They make the data set louder, but they do not make it any clearer.
This is why community trials are so notoriously difficult and expensive to run successfully. If you discover your trial is underpowered, there is truly only one effective escape route. You must increase K. You must increase the total number of distinct clusters.
You have to pack up your field teams, drive to entirely new unsampled villages, and initiate recruitment from scratch. The logistical burden and financial cost of adding new clusters are exponentially higher than simply surveying more people in a town you are already operating in.
This structural vulnerability is why so many community interventions ultimately fail to show a significant result. As Susser astutely noted back in 1995, in the history of community trials, the size of effects has been meager in relation to the effort expended. They frequently fall into the trap of being structurally underpowered from the moment the protocol is signed.
And the 1/rho rule is not the only force actively degrading your statistical power. In community trials, researchers must battle attrition on two distinct fronts.
In a standard clinical trial, individual patients drop out, they move away, they lose interest, or they experience adverse effects.
In a community trial, individuals drop out, but terrifyingly, entire communities can drop out simultaneously. Imagine running a 5-year school-based trial. 3 years in, a new school board is elected, they decide the trial is a distraction from standardized testing, and they withdraw all 10 of their schools from the study overnight.
You don't just lose individuals, you lose massive chunks of your K-value instantly. Combine that dual-level attrition with the fact that these trials are primarily evaluating preventative measures in generally healthy populations, and the challenge becomes immense.
Precisely. When you are operating in a healthy population, you are searching for a reduction in event rates that are already inherently low. Consider a trial aiming to prevent a specific type of cardiovascular event.
If the baseline incidence of that event in a healthy community is only 2% over a 5-year period, and your massive intervention hopes to drive that rate down to 1.5%, the absolute difference you are trying to detect is a mere 0.5%.
Distinguishing a 0.5% true biological signal from the immense background noise of natural population variance requires colossal statistical power, which translates to needing dozens or perhaps hundreds of clusters to definitively prove the intervention works.
Facing these daunting logistical and mathematical headwinds, what strategies can trial architects deploy to synthetically boost their power without having to secure funding for 50 more villages?
The textbook offers several sophisticated analytical techniques. The first involves fundamentally changing how you define and measure the primary outcome. The golden rule is avoid dichotomous variables whenever possible.
A dichotomous variable is a binary yes or no question. For instance, did the participant quit smoking? Yes or no. While clinically relevant, a binary outcome is statistically incredibly weak because it discards a massive amount of nuanced data.
A participant who went from smoking 40 cigarettes a day down to 2 cigarettes a day is classified as no, exactly the same as a participant who never reduced their smoking at all.
To maximize power, you should utilize continuous variables. Ask, how many cigarettes per day is the participant currently smoking compared to their baseline? Continuous variables provide your statistical models with vastly more texture and granularity to work with, which directly translates into increased sensitivity and power.
A second highly effective advanced strategy is to design the trial to analyze net changes from baseline, rather than simply comparing the final absolute cross-sectional scores at the end of the trial. The REIC trial, a major study investigating community interventions designed to reduce patient delay in seeking treatment for acute coronary heart disease, masterfully utilized this approach.
If researchers simply compare the average delay times in the intervention communities versus the control communities at the conclusion of the study, the inherent natural variation between those different communities generates a massive amount of statistical noise.
However, if the researchers meticulously measure the delay times in every community before the intervention begins, and then measure the slope of the change in those specific communities over time, the noise is drastically reduced. The community effectively acts as its own baseline anchor.
Because the correlation between a community's baseline behavior and its follow-up behavior is typically very strong, statistically adjusting for that baseline measurement can dramatically reduce the overall error variance in your models, which in turn effectively shrinks the destructive impact of the intracluster correlation coefficient.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize where we are. We have meticulously designed our trial blueprint. We have navigated the treacherous waters of matched pairs versus stratification. We have optimized our cluster sizes while respecting the 1/row rule, and we have deployed blinded field teams to gather our data without succumbing to detect and treat selection bias.
Now, the trial is over. The data is sitting on our servers. We have to analyze it. We have to defend our findings against the inevitable scrutiny of skeptical reviewers and policymakers. And the very first foundational principle of analysis we must adhere to is the intent to treat principle.
The intent to treat principle is the absolute bedrock of rigorous clinical trial analysis, and its application is even more vital and often more controversial when evaluating community-scale interventions.
The principle dictates a strict rule. Once a subject, or in our context, an entire cluster, is formally randomized to a specific arm of the trial, all subsequent data generated by that cluster must be analyzed strictly as part of that originally assigned group, completely regardless of what actually transpired on the ground afterward.
For example, imagine a trial where a village is randomized to receive a sophisticated new community water filtration system. However, due to cultural suspicion or poor implementation, half the village flatly refuses to drink from the new system, continuing to use their old contaminated wells.
Under intent to treat, you do not drop those non-compliant individuals from your analysis. You certainly do not retroactively move them into the control group data pool. You must keep their health outcomes firmly embedded in the intervention group's final data set.
I can tell you from experience, this concept absolutely drives medical students and junior doctors crazy when they first encounter it. The immediate reaction is usually, but that's completely unfair. That ruins the science. The water filter might be biologically perfect. It might have prevented every single case of cholera if they had just used it. Why are we penalizing the intervention for human stubbornness?
But that reaction fundamentally misunderstands the core objective of public health research. We are not a laboratory testing the purely biological efficacy of a filtration membrane in a sterile beaker. We are evaluating the real-world effectiveness of the entire public health program as a holistic package.
And the messy reality of human noncompliance, suspicion, and behavioral friction is a core component of that real-world package. If a brilliant biological intervention is designed in a way that is so unappealing, culturally insensitive, or difficult to use that the target population rejects it, then that constitutes a failure of the intervention at the population level.
The intent to treat principle forces researchers and ultimately policymakers to confront that uncomfortable reality. It forces a brutal but necessary pragmatism. It prevents researchers from artificially inflating their success rates by quietly excluding all the difficult, non-compliant patients from the final analysis.
But once we have committed to our intent to treat dataset, how do we actually handle the complex mathematics of the clustering during the analysis phase? The analytical approach you choose depends almost entirely on the number of clusters you successfully manage to randomize and retain.
Let's examine small trials first. If you are operating a trial with fewer than 10 total clusters, which, given the immense financial and logistical costs we've discussed, is a very common scenario, the textbook strongly recommends that you restrict your statistical analysis purely to the cluster level.
Right. If you only have 8 villages in your study, do not try to run highly complex individual-level regression models with dozens of variables. The underlying mathematical foundation is simply too unstable with that few clusters.
Instead, the guidance is to collapse the individual data and use straightforward cluster-level tests. If you use a matched pair design, you use a paired chi-test on the differences between the pairs. If you used a completely randomized design, you use a standard two-sample t-test comparing the cluster averages.
Now, if you remember your basic statistics, you might recall that a t-test comes with strict theoretical prerequisites. It assumes the data is perfectly normally distributed and that the variance is constant across groups.
In reality, community cluster data is almost never normally distributed, and the sizes of the villages are wildly variable. Purists might argue that applying a t-test here is a violation of the rules, but the empirical research reveals something quite remarkable.
Extensive empirical simulation studies have consistently demonstrated that the humble t-test is incredibly robust to these theoretical violations. Even when the underlying data is heavily skewed and the cluster sizes vary dramatically, a simple cluster-level t-test holds its ground mathematically and provides highly valid, conservative p-values when you are constrained by a very small number of clusters.
It is a workhorse statistic. However, if you have secured massive funding and are fortunate enough to be analyzing a large trial, typically defined as having more than 20 to 40 distinct clusters, you unlock the mathematical capacity to utilize advanced regression models.
These models allow you to simultaneously adjust for both cluster-level characteristics and individual-level variables. And this transition into advanced regression is the demarcation line that separates the statistical amateurs from the true experts in public health epidemiology.
If you want to understand the modern literature, you have to understand the fundamental difference between the two dominant modeling approaches, GEE and mixed effects models. Let's break this down as clearly as possible, returning to our forest metaphor.
GEE stands for Generalized Estimating Equations. The textbook formally describes GEE as a population-averaged approach.
To intuitively understand GEE, you have to understand the specific mathematical engine it uses to calculate variance, which statisticians affectionately refer to as the sandwich estimator.
The sandwich estimator is considered robust. What that means in practice is that it calculates the error margins based strictly on the actual observed empirical differences between the various clusters, rather than relying on rigid theoretical assumptions about exactly how the echo chamber is functioning inside each individual cluster.
The GEE model essentially says, I don't need to know the exact mechanics of how social interaction works inside village A versus village B. I am simply going to measure the overall outcomes of all the distinct villages and use the variance between them to calculate my final error margins.
Let's apply our forest metaphor here. If you're using GEE, you are flying in an airplane high above the landscape. You are looking down and measuring the average height of dozens of different forests.
You don't care about the specific soil composition underneath any individual tree, and you aren't trying to map the individual root networks. You are just looking at the broad, population-level averages.
The bread of the sandwich estimator is built entirely from those broad between-forest differences. And because it relies so heavily on having enough distinct forests to compare, it requires a large sample size of clusters to function.
If you try to run a GEE model with only 8 or 10 clusters, your sandwich mathematically falls apart. The estimator collapses, becomes highly unstable, and will likely give you a false sense of confidence in your results. You truly need a minimum of 20 to 40 clusters for GEE to be mathematically sound.
But when used correctly, GEE is absolutely brilliant for evaluating the primary effect of an intervention that is applied to the cluster as a whole. It directly answers the policymaker's question. On average, across all populations, what happens when we implement this new policy?
Now, we must vividly contrast that with mixed effects models, specifically looking at logistic normal models, which are used for binary outcomes like disease incidence. Mixed effects models operate on a fundamentally different philosophy. They take a cluster-specific approach.
Instead of treating the messy within cluster correlation as a statistical nuisance that needs to be bypassed using a robust sandwich estimator, mixed effects models lean into it.
They explicitly, mathematically, model the internal dynamics of the cluster. They accomplish this by injecting what are called random effects into the regression equation. A random effect is a unique, mathematically estimated parameter assigned to every single cluster in the study.
Staying with our metaphor, if GEE is flying over the forest in an airplane, a mixed effects model is walking through the forest on foot. The model essentially says, okay, I acknowledge that the soil in Forest A has a baseline growth advantage of +2, while Forest B is situated on rocky terrain and has a baseline disadvantage of -1.
It explicitly quantifies and models the specific, unique flavor or baseline environment of each individual cluster. And because it takes the time to map out the environment, mixed effects models are incredibly powerful tools when a researcher wants to investigate the impact of individual level covariates interacting within that environment.
If you want to understand how a patient's specific age, gender, or individual baseline blood pressure interacts with the new community health clinic inside their specific village, you must employ a mixed effects model.
It is a subtle mathematical distinction, but it has profound implications for how the results are interpreted. GEE is for determining population-level averages. Mixed effects is for exploring cluster-specific, individual-level dynamics.
And all of these highly technical analytical choices must be seamlessly integrated with the temporal architecture of your study design. Specifically, are you conducting a cohort study or a cross-sectional study over the duration of your trial?
This represents another agonizing trade-off for the trial designer. In a longitudinal cohort study, the field team identifies a specific group of, say, 5,000 named individuals at the very beginning of the trial, and they relentlessly track those exact same 5,000 people over the entire 5-year span of the study.
From a purely statistical standpoint, a cohort design is incredibly powerful. Because you have baseline data on the specific individuals, you can perfectly track how their individual health trajectories change over time in response to the intervention. You are controlling for their individual biology.
But the operational reality is brutal. You run headfirst into severe attrition bias. Over 5 years, people move away, they change their phone numbers, they lose interest, or tragically, they pass away.
And the critical issue is that attrition is rarely random. If the people who drop out of your study are fundamentally different from the people who stay in trial, for example, if the sickest, most vulnerable patients drop out because they are simply too exhausted to fill out your annual surveys, your final data set at year 5 is hopelessly, permanently biased towards the healthy survivors.
The primary alternative to avoid that trap is the cross-sectional design. In a repeated cross-sectional approach, you completely abandon the idea of tracking specific individuals. Instead, in year 1, your field team takes a random representative sample of the town's population to establish a baseline snapshot of the community's health.
Then, the intervention runs for 5 years. In year 5, the field team returns to the town and draws a completely new, independent random sample of whoever happens to be living there at that time.
You have completely neutralized individual dropout bias because you aren't trying to follow anyone. However, the cost is a significant loss of statistical precision. You can no longer control for individual baseline values. You are no longer measuring the changing health of specific people. You are merely measuring the changing overall temperature of the town.
This raises an important question. Discussing the overall temperature of a town brings us to perhaps the most complex and heavily debated aspect of this entire field, the ethical reality of this work. Because when you transition from analyzing data in a spreadsheet to actively altering the environment of a living community, you cross a major ethical threshold. You cannot just experiment on a town without asking.
The issue of consent in community trials is structurally profound. In standard clinical research, the ethical framework is clear and highly individualized. A physician sits across a desk from a patient, thoroughly explains the potential risks and anticipated benefits of a new experimental pill, and the patient exercises their personal autonomy by signing an informed consent document.
But when you are randomizing entire municipalities or regional school districts to receive sweeping public health interventions, the concept of individual autonomy fractures and becomes incredibly complicated to uphold.
The sources outline 2 completely distinct ethical frameworks that researchers must navigate, depending entirely on the physical nature of the intervention. The first category is what Edwards and colleagues define as cluster-cluster trials.
These involve interventions that are intrinsically applied to the entire physical or social environment simultaneously. Water fluoridation is the quintessential example. If a city decides to fluoridate the reservoir, you physically cannot pipe fluoridated water to house number 10, but magically bypass house number 12 because the resident there opted out.
Mass media campaigns operate on the same principle. You cannot broadcast a pervasive public health warning on local television and radio and then tell the control group citizens that they are ethically obligated to cover their eyes and ears.
In these cluster-cluster trials, the ability for an individual to truly opt out is a practical impossibility. Therefore, the ethical governance models must adapt. They rely on the concept of gatekeeper consent.
A gatekeeper is a democratically elected representative or an officially appointed authority figure, a city mayor, a regional public health director, or a district school superintendent. This individual acts as the legal and ethical steward for their defined population.
They are tasked with rigorously reviewing the scientific proposal, critically assessing the potential risks against the promised benefits, and formally granting consent on behalf of the entire cluster for the trial to proceed within their jurisdiction.
Major international ethical bodies, including the World Health Organization and CIMs, officially recognize gatekeepers' consent as a valid and necessary ethical framework when individual consent is structurally impossible to obtain.
However, the ethical landscape shifts significantly when we look at the second category, individual cluster trials. In these trial designs, the cluster is the unit of randomization, but the intervention itself is delivered on an individual basis.
Consider a trial where a school district is randomized to evaluate a new in-school HPV vaccination program. The school itself is the cluster, but the vaccine is a physical intervention delivered into the arm of an individual student.
In this scenario, the school superintendent might provide the initial gatekeeper consent simply to allow the research team onto the school grounds to conduct the trial. But crucially, the individual student, and by extension their parents or legal guardians, retains absolute, inviolable autonomy to refuse the actual intervention.
Exactly. The cluster is randomized to be systematically offered the intervention, but no individual is ever forced to accept it.
But navigating these ethical waters extends far beyond simply securing the correct signatures on a consent form before the trial launches. The ethical obligation extends into the long-term, ongoing stewardship of these programs.
And this brings us full circle back to the Streetley and Elser's text concerning population screening. Because a national screening program is, in essence, a massive, permanent community intervention trial that never actually ends.
This is a vital point for policymakers to internalize. A standard clinical trial has a heavily regulated architecture. It has a predefined end date, and it has an independent data safety monitoring board, a DSMB, that continuously reviews the incoming data and possesses the absolute authority to immediately halt the trial if evidence emerges that the experimental drug is causing unforeseen harm.
But national screening programs often operate without those safety nets. Once a government allocates the budget and launches a screening program, it often lacks formal, pre-established interim stopping rules. It becomes deeply institutionalized into the healthcare apparatus.
This institutionalization is where governments must rise to the challenge of acting as rigorous, objective stewards of public health. They must continuously and relentlessly evaluate their ongoing programs against the classic Wilson and Youngner criteria established in 1968.
Those criteria demand that the condition being screened for must be an important public health problem. There must be an accepted and effective treatment for patients with recognized disease. And crucially, the overall benefits of the screening program must unequivocally outweigh the cascade of physical and psychological harms it generates.
When new, robust epidemiological evidence emerges, demonstrating that a legacy program is now causing more harm than good, the government has a profound ethical mandate to shut it down.
But as we explored earlier with the popularity paradox, shutting down a program is a political nightmare. The textbook provides two deeply sobering historical case studies illustrating exactly how slow and agonizing this process can be. The first example comes from Denmark.
In the mid-20th century, mass miniature radiography routine chest x-rays was implemented to screen for tuberculosis. It was an effective tool when TB was rampant.
However, decades later, when TB had been effectively eradicated from the general Danish population, the screening infrastructure remained deeply entrenched. They were still running mandatory chest x-ray stations for all new employees entering large corporations, like the massive Carlsberg breweries.
They were systematically irradiating tens of thousands of perfectly healthy young adults to screen for a disease that was practically non-existent.
Despite the obvious epidemiological reality, it took nearly 20 years of bureaucratic fighting to finally close those screening stations and halt the generation of radiation-induced cancers they were undoubtedly causing.
The second, perhaps more tragic example is the Japanese neuroblastoma screening program. In 1985, Japan initiated a nationwide program screening all 6-month-old infants for neuroblastoma, a type of pediatric cancer, by testing their urine for specific chemical markers.
The program was launched with the absolute best of intentions, aiming to catch the cancer early and save lives. The uptake was massive. Tumors were detected, and infants underwent severe abdominal surgeries and chemotherapy.
However, by 1990, an international panel of experts reviewed the accumulating epidemiological data and uncovered a horrifying reality election. The screening program was not reducing the overall mortality rate from neuroblastoma at all. The aggressive, fatal tumors were still emerging between screens.
The tumors the screening program was detecting were almost entirely indolent, biologically benign variants that would have spontaneously regressed and disappeared on their own without any medical intervention.
The program was driving a massive epidemic of severe overdiagnosis, leading to unnecessary life-altering surgeries on healthy infants. Yet, despite this overwhelming international evidence, the program was politically so popular and entrenched that it took until 2014, agonizing years later, for a national committee to finally mandate its cessation.
Why does it take over a decade to stop harming people? Because public health operates within a political economy. There are massive entrenched conflicts of interest. Local health agencies and bureaucracies fiercely fight to protect their annual budgets.
Commercial laboratories and pharmaceutical companies that manufacture the testing reagents and treatments aggressively lobby to protect their profit margins. And advocacy groups, fueled by the survivor bias of the popularity paradox, stage emotional protests against any attempt to defund the program.
The sources make the structural solution absolutely clear. To overcome these deeply entrenched interests, a nation must establish central, completely independent national governance bodies. You cannot allow the bureaucrats whose careers depend on running the screening program to be the same people tasked with objectively evaluating its effectiveness.
You need insulated, unbiased research units endowed with the ultimate legal authority to pull the plug.
The stakes underlying these methodological and governance debates are incredibly high. The costs of not having rigorous trial designs or failing to establish independent evaluation bodies are not merely measured in wasted financial resources.
They are measured directly in human suffering. The severe psychological anxiety of millions of false positives, the irreversible physical damage inflicted by the overtreatment of overdiagnosed conditions, and the tragic diversion of finite healthcare resources away from evidence-based interventions that actually save lives.
As we conclude this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you with a final forward-looking perspective that bridges these complex statistics with the future of medicine.
We currently live in an era that is absolutely obsessed with the promise of precision medicine. The prevailing narrative is entirely focused on tailoring bespoke molecular therapies to a single patient's unique DNA, sequencing individual genomes, and hyper-personalizing care.
And the biological science behind that is undeniably miraculous. But the mathematical realities and historical lessons of the community intervention trials we have unpacked today reveal a profound, almost philosophical truth about our species. Human health is deeply, inextricably collective.
Your individual health is statistically tethered to the environment of your neighbor. Your personal risk of developing a smoking-related illness is heavily influenced by your city's zoning laws and social norms.
Your risk of contracting an infectious disease is dictated by the herd immunity generated by your local school district. Your risk of suffering the trauma of a false positive or overdiagnosis is entirely dependent on the rigor of the national screening policies established by your government.
As we push further into the frontier of hyper-individualized clinical care, we have to pause and ask ourselves a critical systemic question. Will the greatest leaps in our future global life expectancy come from sequencing the genome of the individual tree or from fundamentally re-engineering the public health ecosystem that we all share?
That is a vital, necessary question for any public health practitioner or clinician to carry with them. And now, to ensure that these dense methodological frameworks actually stick in your memory, it is time for our learning reinforcement. We are going to run through 6 rapid, single best answer recall prompts drawn directly from the core concepts of the Oxford textbook chapters.
I will read the prompt, provide a brief pause for you to formulate your answer, and then I will deliver the correct response and the specific section reference for your continued study. Let's lock this knowledge in. Question 1. In the context of cluster randomized trials, what is the specific term for the tendency of responses among individuals living within the same cluster to resemble each other, which ultimately leads to between-cluster variation?
The correct answer is the intra-cluster correlation coefficient, commonly abbreviated as ICC and mathematically denoted by the Greek letter rho. You can review the underlying mechanics of this in the section titled Impact of the Intra-Cluster Correlation.
Moving to question 2, true or false? If a researcher calculates that the intracluster correlation coefficient rho is less than 0.01, it is methodologically safe to ignore it in sample size calculations because the value is so close to 0.
That statement is absolutely false. As we demonstrated, even a seemingly microscopic rho can drastically increase the variance inflation factor, effectively slashing your statistical power if the cluster size, denoted as EM, is large. Ignoring it is an exercise in self-deception. This is detailed comprehensively in the section determining the required size of the trial.
Question 3. According to the strict definitions established by the UK National Screening Committee, how does opportunistic testing differ from true population screening?
Opportunistic testing is applied non-systematically to existing patients within a clinical setting who are already seeking care for other issues. True screening is a proactive, systematic service offered to a defined, targeted population people who currently presume themselves to be completely healthy. Review this critical distinction in the section Concepts in Screening.
Question 4. When trial architects randomize intact communities to minimize experimental contamination, what specific form of bias is introduced if field recruiters identify and enroll individual subjects after the community has already been publicly assigned to the intervention or control arm?
That operational sequence introduces detect and treat bias, which is a severe form of selection bias. Field recruiters may consciously or unconsciously alter their recruitment effort based on their knowledge of the intervention assignment, resulting in unbalanced cohorts. This vulnerability is found in the section Subsampling and the Risk of Selection Bias.
Question 5. Which advanced regression modeling approach is philosophically considered a population average method, relies on the robust sandwich variance estimator, and typically requires a strict minimum of 20 to 40 individual clusters to be mathematically valid?
The correct answer is Generalized Estimating Equations, or GEE. You can review the technical nuances and appropriate applications of this model in the section Adjusting for Covariates.
And question 6, our final prompt. In a community trial, once your individual cluster size M mathematically exceeds the value of 1 divided by rho, what is the only mathematically effective method to significantly increase the overall statistical power of your trial?
To escape that mathematical ceiling, you must increase the total number of distinct clusters in the trial, denoted as K. Continuing to recruit more individuals into the existing clusters will yield diminishing, eventually zero, returns. Review this critical design constraint in the section, ensuring the power is adequate.
Excellent work. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the foundations of public health methodology. Here are the details of this episode.
Methodological issues in community intervention trials. Byline. When the unit of change is a community experimentation at scale,